Well, this morning, both in worship and in ABC, we are kicking off a brand new series. It's called Newsflash, Getting the Sacred Story Straight. And in this series, we are just taking a look at the greatest story of all time. And the greatest story of all time is the story of Jesus. It is the story of the gospel. And part of the reason that we have decided to do this series about Jesus and about the gospel is because in our day and in our age, there seems to be a lot of confusion over who Jesus was and what the gospel is and what the gospel entails. In fact, I was taking a look at a survey the other day, and this was a survey of Christians. And they were asked a very simple question. The question was this: what is the gospel? Now, traditionally, we would say the gospel is that Jesus died on a cross in our place for our sins. And so when it comes to salvation, there is nothing that we can do to earn that salvation. It is not about what we do. It is about what Christ has done for us. It is a free gift of God. That is eternal life given to us through the cross. That is the gospel message. And so they were looking for an answer that roughly paralleled that particular gospel message. Do you realize that 99% of people who said they were Christians could not articulate the gospel? They could not talk about how Jesus died on the cross in their place for their sins. They could not talk about how the gospel is all about what Christ has done and not about what we do. 99% of people in the survey who said they were Christians did not know the basic fundamentals of the gospel. And that's why we're doing this series. I'll tell you what, as Christians, we are called to be keepers and caretakers of that message, the gospel. That Christ died on a cross in our place for our sins. That salvation is not because of what we do, but because of what Christ has done. We're called to be keepers and caretakers of that gospel. And not only that, we are called to show and share the gospel with everybody all over the world. Theme verse for this series, Mark 16, verse 15. Jesus says, "Go into all the world and preach the good news." That's the gospel. Preach the good news to all creation. Now, if we're going to preach the good news to all creation, we need to know exactly what that good news is. And so in this series, we're just asking some very basic, very simple, very fundamental questions about the gospel. Questions like who, what, when, where, and why. Because if you're a news reporter, if you want to get a news story straight, those are the questions that you ask. Well, the gospel is good news. And so we're going to ask some of those basic questions about the gospel so that we can get the sacred story straight. And so this morning, as we kick off our series, we're going to begin with the question of who. Who is it exactly that the gospel is for? Who is it precisely that Jesus came for? Back in 1970, two churchmen, one named Donald McGavran, the other C. Peter Wagner, wrote a book called Understanding Church Growth. And in this book, they outlined what they call the homogeneous unit principle. I know this is a fancy term, but the basic idea of the homogeneous unit principle is that people who are most similar to each other tend to like to be with each other. The old adage kind of describes the homogeneous unit principle. Birds of a feather do what? They flock together. Yeah, so people who are most like each other tend to like to be with each other. And what they did was they took this reality of the homogeneous unit principle and they factored it in to church growth. This is what they wrote in their book. They said people like to become Christians without crossing racial, linguistic, or class barriers. People who are like each other like to be with each other. That's what Wagner and McGavran said. And this is kind of true. For better or for worse, this often happens. We tend to divide ourselves up into groups. We tend to divide ourselves up into classes. We tend to divide ourselves up into sides, right? There are people on our side, people who are like us, people who share our interests, live in our zip code, root for our teams, believe as we do, live like we do, and then there are people on the other side. People who aren't quite so much like us. People who maybe don't share our interests. People who don't live in our zip code. People who don't root for our teams. People who don't believe like we do. People who don't live like we do. And just in general, we tend to spend a lot more time with people on our side than we do with people on the other side. It's really interesting how we talk about this, right? We have our side of the tracks, and then we have the other side of the tracks. A lot of times we'll even call it the wrong side of the tracks, right? Because the people on the other side of the tracks, or the wrong side of the tracks, they may dress differently than we do. They may live in different kind of houses than we do. They may make different amounts of money than what we make. In San Antonio, we got the north side and the south side. People from the north side get a little bit nervous about going down to the south side. People on the south side don't venture up to the north side too much. That's the homogeneous unit principle at work. In politics, we have our side of the aisle, and then we have the other side of the aisle, right? You got the Republican side, and you got the Democrat side. And my guess is whatever side of the political divide you happen to be on, you tend to surround yourself with like-minded people, right? If you're an R and you happen to be around a D, or if you're a D who happens to be around an R, my guess is you probably don't try to learn so much from that other person as you try to persuade that other person, because you want them to join you on your side. It's the homogeneous unit principle at work. This happens in sports all the time. We got our team on our side, then we got that other team on the other side. I'm a Texas Longhorn, hook 'em horns. That's my side. I like to go to Darrell K. Royal Memorial Stadium. I like to wear my burnt orange. I like to do this in the stands. That's my side, but I am keenly aware that there is the other side. I call it the dark side. The dark side of teams who, like, oh, I don't know, really cross over, even maybe from the Big 12 to the SEC. It's just not good. There's my side and there's the other side. Now, the good news is I'm pretty sure that Jesus is on my side on this one. And so I tend to surround myself with Longhorns, although I know I'm in mixed company here. It's the homogeneous unit principle at work. And so you guys get the idea, right? There's our side, and then there's the other side. And just in general, we tend to stick with people who are on our side. Now, all of that takes us to our text for today. Because this morning we're going to be talking about sides. And specifically, we're going to be talking about what happens when people who are on one side of something all of a sudden get drugged across to the other side of something. How do they react? How do they respond? And how does it change them? And so our text for today, Mark 4, beginning at verse 35. If you got a Bible out of the center of the table, you're going to find it on page 710. Page 710. Mark 4, beginning at verse 35. That day, when evening came, Jesus said to his disciples, "Let us go over to the other side." Now, I want to pause right there and just begin by setting a little bit of context here for you. Jesus has just gotten through with a very long day of ministry. In Mark chapter 4, Jesus is very popular. He has throngs of adoring fans that are crowding around him, wanting to hear him teach, wanting to be touched by him, wanting to be healed by him. If you back up to the beginning of the chapter, Mark 4, verse 1. Again, Jesus began to teach by the lake. The crowd that gathered around him was so large that he got into the boat, he sat in it, and he went out on the lake, while all the people were along the shore at the water's edge. The crowds in Mark 4 that are flocking around Jesus are so huge that Jesus cannot even teach from the land. He has to go out onto the water. I was reading an article the other day about how sound actually seems louder when you're out on the water. Have you ever noticed this? If you're out on the lake, if you're in a boat, if you're going fishing, if you're doing something like that, sometimes you can hear somebody hundreds of yards away. They're having a conversation, and it sounds crystal clear. There's actually a scientific reason for this, the article said. It's because the water cools the air right above the surface, and that slows down the sound waves, refracts them, and focuses them so that they're easier for people to hear. Now, even in the first century, people knew that sound seemed a little bit louder on water. And so Jesus has such a huge crowd around him that he uses a little bit of God-given technology. He goes out on the water because it helps his voice project, and he can teach this crowd of thousands of adoring fans. And Mark 4 says that Jesus pretty much spends all day out on the lake teaching the crowds. Now, you got to understand that spending a whole day teaching, that's kind of tiring. I mean, on Sunday mornings, I spend 2 hours teaching at 9:30 and 11. You know what I do on Sunday afternoons? Take a nap. Because teaching, yes, talking, can be a little bit tiring. And so Jesus spends the whole day teaching. And now near the end of Mark 4, the day has ended, the evening has come, and if you're going to spend a whole day teaching, you're going to be dog-tired. And so Jesus says to his disciples in verse 35, let us go over to the other side. Now, you need to understand that little phrase, the other side. That is a technical phrase to refer to a certain region known as the Decapolis. In Greek, the word Decapolis means 10 cities. In fact, take a look up here on the map on the screen. On the left side, you're going to see the areas of Israel. Galilee and Judea, but then the other side, on the other side of the Sea of Galilee, on the other side of the Jordan River, you're going to see this area known as the Decapolis. Now, if you were a Jew who lived in Israel, if you were a Jew who was from Galilee in the first century, you did not want to go over to the other side. You did not want to go over to the Decapolis, because for you, that was the wrong side of the tracks. That was the wrong political party. They were rooting for the wrong team. This was not a place that you wanted to be. The Jews of the first century considered the other side to be an evil side. Now, they considered the other side to be an evil side for a couple of different reasons. First, the Decapolis was a center of Greek and Roman culture. You guys may remember Alexander the Great. He was actually the one who founded the 10 cities of the Decapolis. And he specifically set them up to be centers of Greek culture. He set them up to be models for the rest of his empire. And because he set them up to be models for the rest of his empire, all of these cities had all of the things that came with Greek culture and Greek sinfulness. There were lots of temples in these cities dedicated to all of these pagan and foreign gods. There were theaters in these cities that hosted R-rated racy productions. There were stadiums in these cities that, especially in the days of Rome, were home to the gory, bloody spectacles of the gladiators. And if you were a Jew, you weren't interested in any of this. All of this was evil, all of this was debased, all of this was depraved, and you just wanted to stay away. But that wasn't the only reason that you didn't like the other side. That was the only reason you didn't like the Decapolis. Long before Alexander the Great, there was a Jewish rabbinic tradition that said the 10 cities of the Decapolis was where the Canaanites settled after the Canaanites were driven out of Israel when the Israelites were first entering into the Promised Land. You may remember the story. This is the story of Joshua. Joshua crosses the Jordan River. They enter into the Promised Land. And there are Canaanites who are living there. And so God gives to Israel a commission that they are to drive out the pagan Canaanites. Joshua 3 verse 10. The living God is among you. And he will certainly drive out before you the Canaanites, Hittites, Hivites, Perizzites, Girgashites, Amorites, and Jebusites. Those are all collectively called the Canaanites. And these became known in Jesus' day as the 7 nations of Canaan. Acts 13, verse 19, Paul is talking about Israel's history, and he says, God overthrew the 7 nations of Canaan and gave their land to his people as their inheritance. And so the Decapolis was where the 7 nations of Canaan settled. Now, if you were a Jew, the 7 nations of Canaan were your enemies. You defeated them once a long time ago with Joshua, and you didn't want to go and live where they were again. The Decapolis was the place where a bunch of godless pagans carried out a bunch of godless pagan activities. There was a Benedictine monk. His name was Virgil Pixel. And he's done a lot of work on this, and he's pointed out that in the Decapolis in the first century, there were still ancient descendants of the Canaanites living there, and they still engaged in all sorts of pagan activities. The Canaanites engaged in all sorts of sexually perverse activities there. The Canaanites practiced child sacrifice there. The Paganites sacrificed pigs to demonic gods there. We talked about this last week. According to Jewish dietary restrictions, are pigs clean or unclean animals? They are unclean. And so imagine this, you're a Jew, you wind up in the Decapolis, what do you see? You see pagan worship, you see child sacrifice, you see pig sacrifice, and your skin just crawls. You want to get out of there as quickly as you can. Because the worship practices of these pagans were disgusting. They were reviled by the Jews of the first century. I never noticed this before I was preparing for this particular adult Bible class. Isaiah 65. God is talking about aberrant worship practices. He's talking about practices that the Jews would never want to get involved in. Isaiah 65 verses 4 and 5. God says these are pagan worship practices. Pagan worship practices involve those who sit among the graves and spend their nights keeping secret vigil, those who eat the flesh of pigs, those whose pots hold broth of unclean meat, those who say, "Keep away, don't come near me, for I am too sacred for you." God says if you're a pagan, your worship practices are disgusting. In fact, they involve three main things. Number one, you spend a lot of time among the dead. You spend a lot of time in graveyards. Because a lot of these false gods, you would worship them by worshiping the dead. And so a lot of your worship services, you just go over to the cemetery and you hold your worship service there. Isaiah also says, if you're a pagan, you eat the meat of pigs. You sacrifice pigs. You boil pigs and unclean meats for the Israelites. And then God finally says, if you're a pagan, you cry out. You say things like, "Keep away, don't come near me, for I am too sacred for you." And so, three characteristics of pagan worship. Number one, you worship among the tombs. Number two, you're big into pigs. And number three, you cry out. Keep those three characteristics in mind, because they will become important in just a second. Back to Mark 4. Jesus has just gotten through with a long day of ministry. And he says to his disciples, "You know that pagan place, the Decapolis? That's where I want to go with you." Jesus says to his disciples, "Let us go over to the other side." Now, you got to think that when the disciples hear this, they're going to be flabbergasted, right? Because they're tired, just like Jesus is tired. They want to get away, just like Jesus wants to get away. And there are so many places they could go. They could go to the beautiful Judean countryside. That would be nice. They could go to the banks of the Mediterranean Sea. That's resort country. Take a look up here on the screen. That is actually in Israel on the banks of the Mediterranean Sea. Doesn't that look pretty? But Jesus doesn't say, "Hey, let's go to the banks of the Mediterranean Sea. Let's hang out in the Judean countryside." After a long, harrying day, Jesus says, "I want to get away, and I got the perfect place. The other side. Let us go over to the Decapolis." You know, that's kind of like inviting somebody on an all-expenses paid trip, 5 days, 4 nights to North Korea. It just doesn't sound very pleasant. Okay? And it's kind of like going on the Carnival Triumph. Nobody's going to want to do that ever again. That's the kind of vacation that Jesus is inviting his disciples. Now, it's interesting because as soon as the disciples try to get over to the other side, as soon as they try to get over to the Decapolis, they begin to encounter some trouble. Mark 4, verse 36 now. Leaving the crowd behind, they took Jesus along just as he was in the boat. There were also other boats with him. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. Anybody in here ever been in a situation where you're trying to get something done, you're trying to go somewhere, and nothing seems to be going right, and you almost cannot help but interpret it as kind of a bad omen? I'm guessing that's what the disciples have to be thinking of. They don't want to go over to the other side. They don't want to go over to the Decapolis. Jesus says, "Hey, that's where I want to go." And so the disciples kind of go along with it, but then as soon as they get out on the water, what happens? A big storm comes up. And the disciples have to be thinking to themselves, I knew it. This is kind of like the red light district at 2 a.m. Nothing good happens there. Why in the world are we going over to the other side? And the disciples are worried, the disciples are upset, the disciples are terrified. Jesus is utterly unconcerned. Mark 4, verse 38. Jesus was in the stirrup. He was sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" Quick note on the Greek here. The word for drown is the word apollomy. Now, we encountered this word apollomy last week when we studied the story of the prodigal son. The father says of the prodigal son, "The son of mine was dead, but now he's alive again. The son of mine was lost, but now he's found." Greek word for lost here is the word apollomy. And we talked about how the word apollomy doesn't just denote physical danger, it also denotes spiritual peril. Because when this son was wandering away from his father, the basic lesson of the story was that just like that son, we too wander away from our heavenly Father. And that puts us in spiritual peril. And so, when the disciples go to Jesus and they say to Jesus, "Hey, don't you care if we drown?" There's the physical danger, but there's also the spiritual danger. There's the physical concern of the waves. There's also the spiritual concern of going over to the other side. The disciples are interpreting this spiritually, and they're thinking to themselves, God must be mad at us for going over to a place like that. This has to be a bad idea. God is condemning us. God is raining down his wrath on us. God is going to make sure that we fall. But Jesus knows better. Mark 4, verse 39. Jesus got up. He rebuked the wind. He said to the waves, "Quiet. Be still." Then the wind died down and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" They were terrified and they asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey it." The disciples are concerned about making it to the Decapolis. Jesus decides that he's going to smooth the way. Jesus, in Mark 4, is really determined to get to the other side. The place where nobody else is. He's determined to minister to the people that nobody else wants to see. He's determined to touch some hearts that nobody else is even going to try to touch. Jesus is about the other side. And in Mark 5, he finally gets there. Mark 5, verse 1. They went across the lake into the region of Galilee. When Jesus got out of the boat, a man with an evil spirit came from the tombs to meet him. This man lived in the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain. For he had often been chained hand and foot, but he tore the chains apart, and he broke the irons of his feet. No one was strong enough to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and in the hills, he would cry out, and he would cut himself with stones. When Jesus is in Mark 4 and he's preaching and teaching in Galilee, the crowds around him are so huge, they're so massive, that he has to go out into a boat, teach from the lake, just so that people can hear him. But Jesus is no longer on Galilee turf. Jesus is no longer on his side. Jesus is now on the other side. And Jesus may be real popular in Galilee, but when it comes to the Decapolis, nobody cares. Jesus gets over to the other side, and he has a welcoming committee of one man who is demon-possessed, who lives among the tombs, cuts himself, and cries out. Think about this for just a second. He lives among the tombs. Where did the pagans in Isaiah 65 worship? Among the tombs. Okay? He cries out day and night. What did the pagans in Isaiah 65 do? They cried out. We've seen this before in Isaiah 65. This right here in Mark chapter 5 is rank paganism on parade. This is what happens when you get into demonic worship. This is what happens when you don't worship way the people on the right side worship, you wind up like this. This is bad news. There's evil stuff happening here. There's wicked stuff happening here. There's depraved stuff happening here. Mark 5, verse 6. When this demon-possessed man saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and he fell on his knees in front of him, and he shouted at the top of his voice, "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? Swear to God that you will not torture me." For Jesus had said to him, "Come out of this man, you evil spirits." Then Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" The demon replied, "My name is Legion, for we are many." Kind of an interesting name for a demon. The demon's name is Legion. Now, this is a loaded term because in the first century, the Roman army had a massive military, and they divided this military into units of about 5,000 guys. You know what they called these units of 5,000 guys? They called them legions. We have a demon. His name is Legion. Now, there was a specific Roman legion that was stationed in the Decapolis at this time. The name of the Roman legion stationed in the Decapolis at this time was Legio Fretensis. It was actually started by Caesar Augustus in the 40s BC because the empire was going through a period of civil war and unrest. And so, Legio Fretensis was a famous Roman legion, and they had as their emblem a pig. That's what they put as their insignia on their flags. That's what they held up when they marched forward. And so, here is this demon named Legion, kind of echoes a Roman legion whose symbol is a pig. What was the other characteristic of false and foreign worship in Isaiah 65? You would sacrifice pigs. We ain't in Kansas anymore. Everything that's bad about pagans is happening here. Here Jesus encounters a demon named Legion. We have a demon named Legion. We have Roman legions. We have unclean animals. And the question of Mark 5 is this: what's going to happen? Who's going to win? Is it going to be a demonic legion? Or is it going to be Jesus? Mark 5, verse 10. And the demon begged. Now, I love this little phrase. And the demon begged. Because right out of the gate, right out of the chute, we know who is going to win. And it ain't going to be the demon. You see, Jesus is so powerful, he is so almighty, he is so glorious and great and grand, that not even a legion of demons can take him down. Not even a legion of demons are any kind of a match for the power of Christ. The legions of heaven are much stronger and mightier and greater than the legions of hell. You may remember Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. He gets arrested, and one of Jesus' disciples, Peter, gets a little bit overzealous, and so he cuts off the ear of the high priest with his sword. Remember what Jesus says, Matthew 26, verse 52, "Put your sword back in its place, for all who draw the sword will die by the sword. Do you think that I cannot call on my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels?" The Roman army may have legions. Demons may have legions. But Jesus has legions too. And Jesus' legions are stronger and sturdier than any legion of earth or any legion of hell. And this demon legion knows it. And so back to verse 10, and the demon begged Jesus again and again not to send him out of the area. Verse 11, a large herd of course, pigs was feeding on the nearby hillside. The demons begged Jesus, "Send us among the pigs, allow us to go into them." And so Jesus gave them permission, and the evil spirits came out and went into the pigs. The herd, about 2,000 in number, rushed down the steep bank into the lake, and they were drowned. Again, this is great because demon worship, false worship, involved the worship of pigs. The Roman legion in the Decapolis involved the insignia of a pig. And so where do these demons go? They go into a herd of pigs. Again, paganism on parade. This is where the demons want to go because this is where the demons feel most comfortable. And so Jesus sends them into these pigs. Now, the problem is, after Jesus does this, after Jesus frees this demon-possessed man, after Jesus conquers this legion of demons, the people of the Decapolis, when they find out about this, are not too happy about this. Because think about this for just a second. Their whole sacrificial system is all based around sacrificing what animal? Pigs. There are no more pigs. The Roman legion that is stationed in their area has an emblem of a pig. There are no more pigs. Their whole economy is probably built on pigs. There are no more pigs. Imagine, you're a pig herder working for the guy who owned all of those pigs, and you come home and you got no pigs. When you left, you had 2,000 pigs. When you get home, your boss comes to you and he says, "Where are my pigs?" And all you can say is, "Well, I don't really know. They just all might have committed mass suicide." And so the people of the Decapolis are not very happy with Jesus. He's insulted their religion. He's insulted the Roman legion. He's ruined and wrecked their economy. And so they decide that they want Jesus just to do it. Mark 5, verse 17. The people began to plead with Jesus to leave their region. Jesus may be popular in Galilee, but he's not popular in the Decapolis. He's insulted their false gods. He's ruined their pigs. Nobody likes Jesus in the Decapolis except one man. You know who that one man is? The one man that Jesus rescued. The one man that Jesus freed. The one man out of whom Jesus drove the legion of demons. Because now he has been freed from his demonic possession. Now he has been freed up to live a normal life. Now he is rid of the spiritual bondage that he has had to endure for so long. Now his life has been changed. Mark 5, verse 18. As Jesus was getting into the boat, the man who had been demon-possessed begged to go with him. After all, this guy's life has just been changed by Jesus. He's been freed from his demonic possession. Verse 19, but Jesus did not let him. Instead, he said, go home. Go home to your family. And tell them all about how much the Lord has done for you. And how he's had mercy on you. This is kind of an interesting encounter with Jesus. Because so far in the Gospel of Mark, we've had a consistent and clear call from Jesus. You know what that consistent and clear call is? Mark 1, verses 16 and 17. As Jesus walked beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and his brother Andrew casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. Jesus said to them, come, follow me. Mark 2, verse 14, as Jesus was walking along, he saw Levi, the son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax collector's booth. Jesus said to him, follow me. That's the clear and consistent call of Jesus in the gospel. He wants people to follow him. Now, here is this man in Mark chapter 5, and you know what he says to Jesus? He says to Jesus, I want to follow you. I want to be with you. Keep me out of the Decapolis. Bring me out from this other side, over to your side, the man says. And Jesus says, no. You cannot follow me, at least physically. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to follow me by staying right where you are. I want you to follow me by staying on the other side and telling the people among the Decapolis what I have done for you. I want you to be my witness, Jesus. And so that's what this guy does. Mark 5, verse 20. So the man went away and began to tell the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him. And all the people were amazed. Now, we're going to come back to this demon-possessed guy in just a few moments, but for right now, we need to move on from Mark 5 to Mark 6. We're going to switch gears here for a second. Just need you to follow with me. Mark 6, Jesus finally returns from the other side. Jesus finally gets back to his side. Mark 6, verse 1, Jesus left there, and he went to his hometown, and he was accompanied by his disciples. Finally, Jesus and the disciples are out of the dark paganism of the Decapolis. Finally, they're on their home turf, and you know what? Back on their home turf, Jesus is popular again. When Jesus gets back to Galilee, in Mark chapter 6, once again, large crowds begin to gather around him. In fact, in Mark 6, a crowd gathers around him that is so incredibly large that it is made up of 5,000 people. That's a lot of people. 5,000 people that Jesus is teaching and preaching to. He teaches them all day. At the end of the day, they begin to get a little bit hungry. Maybe you've heard this story before. And they begin to want something to eat. And the disciples say to Jesus, all right, let's send them home so they can get something to eat. To which Jesus responds, no, we can give them something to eat. The problem is the disciples can only scrounge up 5 loaves of bread and a couple of fish. And the disciples know that there is no way that that meager pittance of food can feed a crowd of 5,000. And so what does Jesus do? He miraculously multiplies the food so that it feeds 5,000. In fact, he so miraculously multiplies the food that everybody eats. Everybody has their fill. And then, you know what they have at the end of it all? Stuff that we stick in our refrigerator that I won't eat. Leftovers. In fact, they have quite a bit of leftovers. Mark 6, verse 43, the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces of bread and fish. Now, I want you to catch that number 12. One of the things that you'll often see in the Bible is that numbers tend to take on kind of a symbolically significant value. A lot of times numbers aren't there just to be numbers. They are there to communicate a certain theological message. And make no mistake about it, 12. That's a number that carries with it a theological message. How many tribes of Israel were there in the Old Testament? There were 12. How many disciples did Jesus have around him? He had 12. In fact, how many legions of demons how many legions of angels did Jesus say that he could call down from heaven to help him? He said he could call down 12. 12 was one of those big Jewish numbers. Whenever you saw the number 12, immediately you thought, yeah, that's me. I'm part of the 12. I'm part of the 12 tribes of Israel. That is my spiritual heritage. That is my spiritual pedigree. Jesus feeds these Israelites. He feeds these Jews. And he has 12 basketfuls of leftovers left. The theological implication here is that Jesus has come for Israel. He's come for the 12 tribes. He wants to teach them. He wants to preach to them. He wants to help them. Jesus is on their side. He's on the side of the 12. He's on the side of the Jews. He's on the side of the spiritually pure. But that's not the only side that Jesus is on. Fast forward a little bit more to the end of Mark chapter 7. Mark chapter 7, verse 31. Jesus left the vicinity of Tyre and was down to Sidon, down to the Sea of Galilee, and into the region of the Decapolis. Now, go to Mark 8, verse 1. Jesus is back on the other side. He's back in the Decapolis. Now, isn't this interesting? Verse 1. During those days, in the Decapolis, another large crowd gathered. Jesus, he's back on the other side. He's back in the Decapolis. Now, the first time he went to the Decapolis, how many people came out to meet him? 1. Jesus gets all the way to Mark chapter 8. He's back in the Decapolis. How many people come out to meet him? A large crowd. First time Jesus goes there, nobody cares. goes through, everybody cares. What changed? What made these people go from asking Jesus to leave their region to welcoming Jesus with open arms? One man. One man told his story. One man talked about what Jesus had done for him. One man brought just a little bit of light into a whole lot of darkness. And it changed everything. You know, every single year, one of the things that I do is I decorate our house with Christmas lights. And this has now happened 2 years in a row. I put up the Christmas lights. I always test them before I put them up. I get everything ready to go, and I plug them in, and they look all great when I tested them on the ground, but as soon as I get them onto the house, you know what happens? 2 years in a row. I'm not making this up. There's a strand that's out. And so I get a little grouchy, and I pull out the ladder after I put it away, and I begin to try to climb up to the roof line of the house, and I got to go through on the roof line of this house each and every light, because it only takes one light to make a whole lot of darkness. But it's great because all I got to do is get that one little light, and all of a sudden the whole strand lights up. And what is true of Christmas lights on a house is true of one man in the Decapolis. All Jesus had to do was find that one little light, and the whole region lit up. People wanted to see Jesus. People wanted to know Jesus. People wanted to be taught by Jesus. You know, it's interesting. Mark 8 says that the crowd that gathers around Jesus in the Decapolis is 4,000 people. That's a lot of people. I mean, not quite as big as the 5,000 in Galilee, but that's still pretty good. Jesus begins to teach them. He teaches them all day long, gets to the end of the day, and guess what happens to the people in the Decapolis? Just like the people in Galilee, they begin to get hungry. And just like the people in Galilee, the disciples don't have enough food for all these people. They only have a few loaves of bread. And so what does Jesus do? Just like the people in Galilee, he takes a few loaves of bread and he miraculously multiplies them. And he feeds the whole shooting match people. And just like with the people in Galilee, there are leftovers. Now the leftovers are a little bit different here. Mark 8 verse 8, afterward the disciples picked up 7 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. So Jesus is in Galilee, he picks up 12 basketfuls. Jesus is in the Decapolis, he only gets 7 basketfuls. What's going on here? Did Jesus get a little bit better at this miracle, so now he's better at estimating the number of basketfuls of leftover that you should have left over? I mean, Jesus did get a try at it first, right? Is that what's going on here? Actually, I don't think so. Here's actually what I think. Remember the tradition. How many nations of Canaan did the Israelites drive over to the other side? 7. How many basketfuls of leftovers does Jesus gather up when he's in the Decapolis? 7. So Jesus is in Galilee, he's feeding the Israelites, he's there with the Jews, he has the 12 tribes, and he picks up 12 basketfuls of leftovers. Jesus is in the Decapolis, he's there with the 7 nations of Canaan, and he picks up 7 basketfuls of leftovers. You see, it seems that Jesus will even provide for the pagans. Jesus will even teach those who are far from him. Jesus will even care for those who live in spiritual squalor and filth. Mark 8, beginning at verse 18, Jesus says to his disciples, "Do you have eyes but fail to see? And ears but fail to hear? And don't you remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up?" 12, the disciples replied. "And when I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up?" They answered, 7. And so Jesus said to them, do you still not understand? You know, that's the question that Jesus has for us today. Do you still not understand? Do you still not understand that whether Jesus is with 12 tribes in Galilee, or 7 nations in the Decapolis, do you still understand that Jesus cares for them both? The question of this text is this: who did Jesus come from? It's the question of who. Did he come for the 12 tribes of Israel? Or did he come for the 7 nations of Canaan? Did he come for the spiritually stalwart Jews? Or did he come for the religiously rebellious Decapolis folks? Who did Jesus come for? Did Jesus come for Israel, or did Jesus come for the Decapolis? Is Jesus on the side of Galilee, or is Jesus on the side of spiritually rebellious folks? Whose side is Jesus on? The answer is every side. Every side is Jesus' side. Yes, he's on the side of the 12 tribes. He loves Israel. He has not forgotten them. He's going to feed them. He's going to have 12 basketfuls of leftovers for them. But good news is coming for the 7 nations of Canaan. He's going to feed them. He's going to love them. He's going to take care of them too. 12 tribes, 7 nations. To Jesus, doesn't matter what side you're on. Because every side is Jesus' side. Jesus came for everybody. That's why the gospel is for everybody. The most famous verse of the Bible, John 3:16. For God so loved the what? World. Just the Israelite part of the world? Just for the capitalist part of the world? Every part of the world. Every side is God's side. After all, He made the whole world. And so the question that I leave you with this morning is this: what side are you on? Maybe you're kind of the 12 tribes of Israel guy. Maybe you've been in church your whole life. You were baptized in the church. You were married in the church. You got perfect attendance in Sunday school growing up. Lots of gold stars. Maybe you do struggle with a few sins. Maybe arrogance, judgmentalism. Here's what I want you to remember. If you've been in church your whole life, Jesus is on your side. He loves you. He cares for you. He died for you. He leads you. He calls you by name. Jesus is on your side. Then again, maybe you're more of like a capitalist Jew. Maybe you're like one of those 7 nations of Canaan. Maybe you've been through your rebellious phase. Maybe you're still struggling with a rebellious phase. Maybe you're bound by a sin. Maybe you have a habit. Maybe you have a skeleton in your closet. And sometimes, if you're real honest with yourself, you feel like you have about as much hope as that guy who lived among the tombs in Mark chapter 5. If this is you, you need to know Jesus is on your side. He loves you. He cares for you. He can redeem you when you trust Him. He can lead you through your life. Every side is Jesus' side. Because Jesus made every side, He created every side, He loves every side, and He loves you. Very simply, whose side is Jesus on? Well, the answer would be your side. Because the gospel is for you. That's what's for. And that's very good. Let's stand in. Heavenly Father, we're so grateful that even when we are mired in muck and sin, even when we rebel against you, you come after us, you call us to repentance. And you say, you know what? I created the world, every side is my side, and most importantly, we through faith can be on your side. Heavenly Father, may the gospel go forth to every corner, every nook, every cranny of this world. We pray that by your power, people would respond in faith, knowing that everybody can be part of your side. We ask this in Jesus' name.